Now, let's talk really briefly about American Revolution 2 because that's set in Chicago during the Democratic National Convention of 68.
Right.
68? Now, I confess I didn't see the entire thing, but it starts with what you expect to see of the demonstrations and the clashes between the police and protesters. But then it goes off into basically talking to some other people. I believe it's Young Patriots.
Yeah, the Young Patriots and the Black Panthers.
Black Panthers, right?
Well, what happened there is Mike Gray had a film company called the Film Group, and he and some of the other people in the film group had shot a lot of footage of the '68 convention. Howard, on the other hand, was in New York at this time, and he had been working with Bob Dylan on some of his films, and he had worked with Murray Lerner on Festival.
Now, didn't he work on the Bob Dylan film Don't Look Back?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
And so Mike Gray, Howard had started to get a reputation of being a great editor, being able to take mounds of footage and shaping it into really interesting pictures that reflected those times. Mike Gray called Howard in New York and asked him to come to Chicago to help put together some of this footage of the '68 convention. Howard noticed that there was a large omission of black faces in this footage. Omission. And
it was an awful lot of white folks at that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I never thought of that before. I never noticed.
So Howard kind of brokered this relationship with the Chicago branch of the Black Panthers. And he got to know Fred Hampton, and he got to know Bob Lee. And they all of a sudden started to become folded into this vision for this film. And I think the scene that you're talking about is a scene that took place in Uptown with the Young Patriots, and Bob Lee was in talking to them. Bob Lee, a Black Panther, and they were talking about kind of breaking these racial barriers and really talking about class as opposed to black and white issues. And it's an incredible scene. Never before have you seen, at least in those times, had you seen African Americans talking with like poor white Appalachian migrants at that time, and having some kind of bond happen in front of the camera. Well, that was Howard's work.
But and the Young Patriots were not your educated upper middle class and upper middle class youth that were the youth activists that you typically see on film whenever anybody talks about the 60s and protest.
I don't know. I don't know a lot about that organization, but I do know that that they didn't have money. That poverty was part of that scenario.
And that's what the Uptown area was like back then.
Right.
There was a lot of people from Appalachia.
Right.
Right. Okay, so then he did another film about the murder of Fred Hampton, the Black Panther leader who was assassinated, some say, by the Chicago police in his bed.
Yeah, a lot of people. Mike Gray would say that.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure the Chicago police would disagree with that. So then he also did something about Maxwell Street. What was that called? And This Is Free?
And This Is Free. Yeah, he had done this before he went to New York. I believe that was like in the early 60s. And he did that with Mike Shea. And that was...
Who is Mike Shea?
Mike Shea was an incredible photographer at that time, both motion and still. And he was shooting this. He loved jazz, Mike Shea did, and he was shooting all this footage down on Maxwell Street. And they brought Howard in to edit the footage. And this happened, I believe that was in the early 60s that he did that.
Okay.
That film.
Now that was called. Okay, there's the one about Maxwell Street, but there's also a jazz film, correct?
Yes, it was a jazz film, but
there was another one, wasn't there?
Cry of Jazz.
Cry of Jazz. Now, is that in your lineup?
Cry of Jazz, Cry of Jazz, I think, will be screened on Wednesday, the 28th, at the Cultural Center.
Oh, at the Cultural Center. Now, that's something I wanted to point out, sort of midstream here. You are listening to WLUW 88.7, Loyola University's community radio. This is Live from the Heartland. I'm Lisa Smith, and we're talking to Nancy Watrous about the Howard Alk retrospective. And it is going to be, it's several films that Howard was involved in, and it's going to be screening at Gene Siskel and the Chicago Cultural Center. So you've got a couple of options.
That's correct.
Several options, actually.
Right. Wednesdays will be at the Cultural Center, Friday at the Siskel.
Okay.
Generally speaking.
Okay. So back to Howard, he brought sort of a new perspective to the issues of class and race to some of the films that he was working on.
Yeah, Cry of Jazz is probably, I think it's the only film that Ed Bland, who's a composer, made in. Ed was also out of the University of Chicago and made this film that was talking about how jazz is really an expression of the African American community that can't be entirely understood by white people.
That's kind of a racist concept.
Well, perhaps you'd have to talk to him about that. He'll be in town.
Okay. Oh, he's going to be in town for the retrospective, for the screenings.
All our screenings we're having people come in that knew Howard, or the filmmakers that were involved with Howard on the particular film that's being shown that night.
So there are a few live ones left who can speak to.
There's a lot of live ones left.
Well, I think it's because he was around, like, back in the 50s. You kind of think that, since Howard himself is passed on, that perhaps many of his colleagues may have been. Who do you have lined up for these various panels?
Okay, we have Murray Lerner, who is director of Festival, is coming in and worked with Howard quite a bit in New York. So he's coming in Tuesday to introduce Festival.
Now, Festival is that
the Newport Folk Festival from, I think, 1963 to 1966. It's a beautiful film.
Now, is that famous one? Or is it, I'm thinking of a different Newport Festival film, maybe.
I don't know what you're thinking
There's
about.
kind of a famous one. Okay.
And then another film that he made that is really, I doubt anybody has seen, is Laxman Baal's movie, which is about a folk minstrel group in the Bengal area of India.
Wow.
And he and his wife Jones Cullinan and Sally Grossman, who was married at the time to Al Grossman, went to India and did a documentary about this Indian minstrel group, and they ended up bringing them back to the States. And cool. It's an incredible film, and it hasn't been seen. So Charlie Capwell, who's a musicologist from the University of Chicago,
ethnomusicologist,
yes, is coming up from the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. He's going to introduce that film because he has a background in that type of music, and he also helped Howard edit that film, which was happening in, actually he edited that film in Ottawa.
He edited it?
In Ottawa, at Budge Crawley's studio.